Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, if the audio is working correctly. I tested it out a little bit earlier, but we'll make sure it's still working for everybody. Okay, looks like it's good. I posted a link in the chat for Poll Everywhere, which is what we're going to be using today. But today we're talking about crafting compelling stories, the key to successful software. This is a very... I think a lot of times teams don't give enough credit to how much efficiencies can be gained by being more careful in how we craft our stories. And we end up doing a lot of things that actually set us behind instead of helping us move forward. So it's a very, very important area we're talking about today. Okay, so the thing in Poll Everywhere we wanted to see is kind of what describes your role on the team. If you put a space in it, it breaks it up as separate things. You can put an underscore in it. I've got something about dogs here. That's interesting. Product owner or dogs owner. I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, just wanted to kind of see where people were at. Scrum Master. Okay, very good. And let me tell you what. Let me paste this here one more time for you, so you can join. If you open, you should be able to see it in WebEx. If you can't see it in WebEx, you can bring it up on your phone using the information up there at the top. And leave it up because we've got a few things that we're going to be looking at as we go. But we're going to start off with a cartoon. We're going to look at a little bit of a background on the user stories, and then we'll go for about 6-minute video, and then we'll be looking at the details of it. So here we go.
Hi, I'm Mark. I help organizations write software more efficiently. A big part of this is helping teams find ways to organize their work in a way that follows agile values and principles. In this video, we're going to talk about creating user stories. User stories aren't agile in and of themselves, but they can be used to help us follow agile principles. For example, here are 3 agile principles that we should keep in mind for this video. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. If working software is the primary measure of progress, we need to make sure we organize and track our work in a way that supports this goal. We need to make sure that our work is organized and chunked into units that represent value to the customer, and we need a way to sort out what is extremely valuable from what is less important. Most teams find that the best way to achieve these things is to visualize their work so it's easy to see what has been done, what is being done, and what is yet to be done. Visualizing the state of various pieces of work can be done in software or even on a wall with sticky notes. But in this video, we want to concentrate just on how to represent the units of work. A good approach is to represent the work through simple stories that describe what the user's world must look like in order to mark a story as complete. Here are some example stories using a typical story template. As a registered user, I want to change my password so I can keep my account secure. As a website visitor, I want to subscribe to the mailing list for a product so I can get product updates through email. As an admin user, I want to disable a user so I can prevent unauthorized logins by past employees. As a mobile app user, I want to save all my data to the cloud so I can access it from another device. There isn't anything magical about this particular format for stories. The examples we've just seen cover who, what, and why. Having a template is a good way to make sure you capture enough information to represent the idea of what the user needs without getting bogged down in all the implementation details. When our development efforts are driven by stories that represent our understanding of user needs, it supports our principles and fosters good development practices. Stories that are written in ways that violate our principles will hinder good development practices. Anything we can do to increase the quality of our stories will make the rest of our development process more efficient. One time, I was working with a team that was just starting to organize their work like this, and we were using a template similar to the one we've just seen. One of the users had missed the initial meeting where we explained what we were trying to do. He was a bit confused and asked why he kept seeing all these short pieces of poetry about software. Evidently, he thought we were writing some strange form of haiku. Good stories start off as fiction. The setting is the world in which the user interacts with the software. The story is written from the user's point of view and talks about things from the perspective of the user. The user perspective is very important because our principles say that we are going to define our progress based on giving the user the ability to do something valuable with the software that they were not able to do before. If we are working on stories that aren't creating business value for the customer, we are doing work that we've explicitly said isn't going to count as progress. So how do we handle all the work we need to do that the user can't see? How do we handle stories about the developer's world? How do we handle stories like this? As a developer, I want a database with all the tables to model the data so I can store information the application needs. This is a bad story because it violates our principles for software development. Notice I said the story is bad, not the idea of having a database to store data. We definitely need a database. But if we create this story, almost all of the application depends on it being done first. We could complete this story and have no functionality we can show our user, nothing they can actually use as working software. But this would violate our principles. Further, the information we need to acquire to complete this story will only be known when we've figured out how we are going to build the other parts of the system. So in effect, a story like this is both a prerequisite for and a dependency of every other story. When you have two things that both depend on the other being done first, you have a recipe for deadlock. If you've ever worked on a story like this, you may have experienced a long period of time where the user is asking how things are going, and the development team is saying, well, we have a bunch of setup work to do first before we can start working on the actual application. There is another way. If you write your stories from the user perspective, you can build just the parts you need in order to create some value for the user. This likely will mean building some of the database, but only the pieces you need as you need them to complete each story. It may seem counterintuitive for developers to build software from the user's perspective, because such an approach means you may have to rework some of the things you've done in the past as future stories become clear. However, software projects that fail usually do so because they weren't focused on delivering actual usable business value to the user on a regular basis. Building the application the way the user thinks about value minimizes this risk. If you are following the other Agile principles, the cost of some rework is trivial compared to the benefits it provides in delivering business value sooner rather than later.
Okay, so that's a very quick overview of some of the things we're going to talk about today. Hopefully that's useful. And I put a link to that video in the chat if it looks like something you want to share with your team. I've heard some teams are getting good use out of using some of these cartoons, like before their daily stand-up. They just look at one, discuss it a little bit, or at the end of it, or something like that. So if that's useful, links there. Also, I want to mention I have a special TV set up just right up here that shows all your smiling faces if you happen to be on video. So for those of you on video, thank you very much. For those of you who are like, I don't know if I should be on video or not, I do like getting to see people, so don't feel compelled to, but just know it is something that's appreciated if you do happen to choose to do that. Okay, so user stories represent work. Question for you: what best describes your feelings about user stories? What best describes your feelings about user stories? I'll put the link here one more time because we had some people join a little bit later. Right there. So is it a silly way to say requirements? A very useful way to capture high-level details of real user needs. Too little information to really be useful. Usually doesn't represent much of what the user actually wants. Love and adoration, or fear, loathing, and hate. added fear. Just loathing and hate is his number is F. Okay, it looks like most of us are saying it's generally a useful way to capture high level details. All of the above. That I should add that option. I see we've got at least one person that says it's kind of a silly way to say requirements. Um, C, too little information to really be useful. One of the things we're going to look at today is that we want the bare minimum amount of information for us to be able to prioritize what we're going to work on next. So by design, it should be very little information, but you should have just enough information to decide whether you want to do this story or that story. So that's if used correctly, that can be a feature, not a bug. Um, and doesn't usually represent much of what the user actually wants. The teams I've seen that are most effective at using user stories are usually using it to decide what to work on next. But before they actually start coding, there's a conversation with the users to decide what's the next, how can we give you the most value with the least amount of time to figure out exactly what goes into the story. So it almost gets, when the story starts being worked on, is the point where you really start, slicing it up and refining to get exactly what the user needs right then. Because when the story was put into the system 6 months ago or something like that, the situation may look very, very different for them today. Okay, moving on. Okay, so if you have Q&A, I'll watch the chat too, but this should stay up where you can add things and we'll try to take a look at it at the end. Okay, so user stories are fiction. Here's some very wonderful fiction right here. We've got all these stories, right? These are nice short stories. If you've ever read a comic book, you've got a story that is somewhat limited in scope. It's not like reading Crime and Punishment or War and Peace or something like that. So if we look at what shows up in the daily, or what used to show up in on the Sunday cartoons, it'd be something like this, right? So we've got 3 panels that represent stories where something happens. You need kind of the context of overall, but the story means something just within those 3. But when I try to think of user stories, what I really like is the example of something from Far Side, right? We've got something that's very, very small, may not even have any words in it, which I'm not saying you don't need words in your story, but it tells a complete story with very, very little information, right? We've got this thing here, you can see what's going to happen. He's going to pop the bag and scare the guy that's working on the missile. Why they're actually hammering nails into the missile, I'm not really sure. And then this one over here, that the guy's on a deserted island, and Genie shows up. He says, well, I've got rhythm, I've got music. Actually, who could ask for anything more? So it's a complete story, just very, very short, but it tells a complete story. And that's what we're looking for in our user stories that describe how we're going to work. Now, the template we mentioned in the video was who, what, and why. So who is that? Who actually wants this thing that we're doing? If you're writing a story and you can't figure out who wants it, it's probably a good indication that no one would notice if you didn't do that. So who's very important. What are we proposing we do? So we can decide whether it's more or less important than something else. And then why is this actually valuable? Now notice a lot of times you see this sneak into stories, the how we're going to do it. You want to actually leave out the how, because if we start injecting how into our user stories, it means we've done work on deciding the how before we've even decided if it's valuable enough to work on. So stories look something like this. Now, there's nothing magical about this type of template. It's useful because it makes sure we get the important things, and sometimes useful in keeping us from putting in lots of extra details that we really don't need at that point. But we can say so who is this going to benefit? I want what it is that we want, so I can, and the so I can just describes why this is actually valuable to me. So here's an example. As a toddler, I want a way to trigger Baby Shark so I can play it on my own. Okay, the nice thing about this story, now we haven't said anything about the how we're going to do it. Is it a big button? Is it going to be voice control? Is it going to be, who a string he pulls? What is it? We don't know, but we know who this is going to be valuable to, the toddler. Maybe valuable to the parents too, or it may be horrible for the parents, depending on what they think of the song, I guess. I want a way to trigger Baby Shark. Now, even that, now that I look at that kind of has a little bit of a how in it, right? Maybe it should be, I want a way to play Baby Shark on demand or something like that. And then we have why, because I want to play it on my own. I don't have to be dependent on someone else to do that. But there's no how in here. So this is generally a good story, or at least headed in the right direction, because we haven't gotten into any of the details of how it's going to work, but we know who this is valuable to, why it's valuable, and what it actually means for this to become reality. So we have to think of how would the world actually be better if this story was to be in, if these things were to come to pass. So here's an example. This is my grandpa in, I think this picture is from Washington, and then one of my aunts with him milking the family cow. It says, as a cow, I want to be milked, so I will be comfortable. Okay, we've got the who, the cow, what, I want to be milked, and then the why that's valuable, so I can be more comfortable. So now the farmer, that was written from the standpoint of a cow, but let's think there might be, maybe this story makes even more sense from the standpoint of the dairy farmer. Maybe the dairy farmer is actually our customer and the cow is not the customer. So as a dairy farmer, I want cows to be milked on demand. So whenever they feel like being milked, so I can maximize production. So here we've got what the farmer wants. He wants cows milked on demand. Why he wants it, so he can maximize production. Now, how will we actually achieve this? Well, that's to be determined, right? We just have enough of the story that we can prioritize and decide whether this is more important to work on next or if there's something else that's more important to work on next. So, ways that this could be done is the farmer could staff the barn 24/7. There's people there just waiting whenever a cow comes in and feels like it wants to be milked, they'll milk it. Or he could rig up some system. We could, as developers, we can make a system for the farmer. So whenever a cow wanders into the milking area to say it wants to be milked, it sets off a buzzer, it wakes him up in the middle of the night, and can come out and milk the cow. Or if you're like some of my friends that live in the area, you can get a bunch of these. These are robotic milking machines, and they've got cleaners down here over there that clean the udders and laser guided sensors to make sure everything attaches right. It's an amazing work of technology. And so whenever the cow is feeling a little bit full, it just wanders in and it measures the cow, weighs the cow, feeds the cow whatever it needs to be fed, and cleans everything, hooks it up, and milks the cow. So this is another way of solving that problem. There's lots of ways to solve it. But the point I want to make with the user story is at this point, we've got the user story. We can then put it on the backlog or work it into sprints. And then when we get into it, we can have a conversation with our customer, the farmer, and say, okay, what do you want to do? We can buy these multi-million-dollar machines. We could build multi-million-dollar machines that will automatically milk the cow. Or would it make more sense to come up with a mechanism that you can staff for 24/7? Or would a buzzer be better? There's all these things, and you have those conversations with the farmer about what the trade-offs are. Maybe he doesn't have $1 million to spend right now. Maybe the buzzer actually works really, really well for him for a few months and until he can hire more people to staff the barn 24/7. The point is, though, you're having those conversations with the user based on what they're wanting to achieve, and the how becomes a discussion with all the trade-offs involved in it. Now, if we put all the how into the story weeks ahead of time, by the time we get ready to actually work on it, the situation may have changed. Maybe the farmer won the lottery, and so buying a bunch of machines to milk the cows is no big deal now. But you don't know that. We wouldn't want to build a bunch of stuff they don't need without having that conversation with the farmer to look at what the trade offs are. So, stories that support our principles foster good development, but bad stories will hinder the development process. Stories start out as a work of fiction written from the user's point of view. And progress means that the user can now do something that makes them happy that they couldn't do before. There's something, it's got a good ending to the story, right? The user is happy now in ways that they weren't able to be happy before. But that also means that waste is what we get if we have stories that don't have any return on investment for the user. For example, if we have a story that looks like this, where we say, as a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline so I can deploy to the cloud. How does that story make you feel? Does that story make you feel just really, really happy? Does it make you feel sad? Somewhere between there? And some of us are kind of in the middle. So if anybody wants to just kind of throw, okay, well, at least a few people like this story makes them feel really, really happy. So throw in the chat, just a few seconds. Why does the story make you feel this way, either happy or sad? What is it about this story that makes you feel one of these things? And look, at some of us just don't, we're just even keel, doesn't matter to us. It's not constrained to a schedule for an on-prem resource. Okay, it may not apply to all the situations. I was assuming going to the cloud. That's yeah, good question, Ian. Why do you want to go to the cloud? What does that do? It's not very fiction-like. I like that. No visible value to the user. So Jeff, yes, what you're saying is the main thing I see with it is we're doing something that probably does have value to the project in some way, but it's not written as a slice from a standpoint of the value it actually provides to the user. The user isn't going to see this. I mean, we may be able to explain it to the user why it's valuable, but it's not an incremental step forward for the user if we're writing it from this dimension. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it does mean that we may want to try to find a different way of approaching the story. So we're giving the user something valuable. And then part of what in that story is contained this thing that is valuable that we want to do, but it's more driven by what the user is actually asking for. This is good answers there on stuff. That's great. Okay, so oh, I got meow and moo. Okay, cool. So yes, this is working evidently. So as a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline so I can deploy to the cloud. I would say this is not a good story. Not that it's bad to build a pipeline. It's not bad to build a pipeline, but what might happen if we start treating the pipeline as progress? Well, we could, and I've actually seen this happen, we could spend a year working on our pipeline before we ever get to the user story, and then discover that when we start working on user stories, the pipeline we built is a not at all fit for purpose that we actually need. Now, that sounds like, oh, that's a funny story. I've actually seen that happen in places that got so focused on stories like this that it was very difficult for them to shift over into letting the user stories actually drive what was needed. So that's a very big risk on projects. The other thing about this story, oh, whoops, no, sorry again. So if we try to switch the story around from as a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline. So let's think of something that the user needs. Well, as a user, I want to see the logo on the page so I know I'm at the right site. Well, if we have within our definition of done that things can actually be deployed all the way, then this will require building some piece of the CI/CD pipeline, just enough to deploy a page and a logo so you can see it. So it's very, very small. There may be 1,000 other things that we're going to do to this CI/CD pipeline eventually. But if I'm driving it with this story, I then build just what I need. And not only do I build what I need, but I use this story to prove that this other stuff is actually fit for purpose. And that can be a very big deal. So this will prove out that the CI/CD pipeline is capable of deploying the application, and not just a theoretical application, but the application that I'm actually building. Oops. Okay, so why do software projects fail? They fail when they fail to deliver working software. So if we build things from the user's perspective, we can lower that risk. So we have to think about, how does the user think about the software? So we want to build things in where our way of dividing up the iterations we're going to deliver are divided up in a way that is driven by how the user thinks about the software. So I'm going to take a quick pause because I threw some announcements just right in the middle. So we'll think about that. We'll come back to it in just a second. Just to let you know, if any of these talks are interesting, there's the URL for the talks there, youtube.com/agilelnl. They get archived there. I think most of them you find under the live tab right now, but we try to always archive those there. So if you ever see a talk or miss talk or want to go back and review something, that's where you get to it. Or if you want to share it with someone, I think it actually streams to it live. We're streaming to it right now. It's a few seconds behind, but it is there. Also, I want to let you know that we did this, I think, a year or so ago. I've got a paid course that I offer on Maven called Improve Your Agile Skills with 5 Business Books. And we do 5 sessions, go through these 5 very important business books, and then discuss in a smaller setting, kind of like we did with Office Hours for people that joined that. We go through a smaller setting and talk about how those books apply within the context of an Agile team. And this is a very, it's a very free-flowing conversation. So very much conversational-based approach. I know I learned a lot of people that were in this first cohort. Anyway, this is coming up. If this sounds interesting to you, you can go to Maven and get on the list. But if this sounds interesting to you, shoot me an email and let me know, because because of the way that Maven.com works, it's beneficial for me to be able to kick things off with when we first launch it, with more people being subscribed and like that are saying they're going to come. So I'll generally have like a preferred pricing for a small group of people that have said that they're interested in it. If you'd like to be on that first potential to get that, send it to me, because it's low enough. I don't want to put it on their website, but I will send it out to people that say they want to be part of that. So just a heads up, if this sounds interesting to you, it'll be a weekly thing. I think we'll probably start it toward the end of March. But shoot me an email saying you're interested in being part of it, and I'll make sure you're on that first early bird pricing option. Peter, actually send me an email, okay? Matter of fact, I'll put my email right here in case anyone feel free to reach out to that. Now, what we've got coming up next week on the 11th, Luca, he's spoken to us before, but he's going to be talking about toward a modern complexity fit philosophy of work management and leadership. Luca is very much I would call him a thought leader. He thinks very interesting thoughts about things. He's always fascinating to listen to. So looking forward to this. This is going to be on the 11th. The next week, I'm going to do an introduction to genetic algorithms. And so this is looking at a style of programming that lets you evolve a solution. So you see an example there where we're taking Abraham Lincoln's picture and evolving something that is starting to look more and more like Abraham Lincoln by using evolutionary processes and random processes. This talk, it'll be interesting because we're going to look at a little bit of code. The code we're using is a style of Lisp, but our goal isn't to really get into all the code other than just kind of showing here's what it does. The goal is to more get you thinking in terms of how can this type of approach be used to solve problems. So even if you're not coding, don't know Lisp, don't know Racket, which is language we'll be using, or even if you're not a developer, I think you should have a lot of takeaways from this about a different style of problem solving that may give you some ability to understand what coders are doing if you're not a coder, or may give you a tool that you may someday find that there's a perfect place to use this. So this is going to be an interesting, I think it's going to be a pretty interesting talk. I'm enjoying it. It's something I've been experimenting with a lot. Anyway, that is on the 18th. And then on the 25th, we've got George Dinwiddie coming to talk to us again. His talk is, so your manager asks you for an estimate. What do you do then? George is, I've always enjoyed everything I've heard him and all the conversations I've had with George. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. And if you work in any place that might possibly ask for an estimate, you will probably really enjoy what George has to say here. And then on the 4th, March 4th, we've got Agile Principle number 8. We're slowly working our way through all Agile Principles. We're on number 8. We've got a new cartoon for that, talking about sustainable development. So that's going to be fun. It will be the premiere of that cartoon. So you'll get to be the first people to see it if you want to. And then we're going to talk through the principles. So that'll be fun. And then on the 11th, we've got Alex Bird is going to be talking about how do you become an expert when you're on the clock. So Alex and I have been going back and forth as he kind of refines this. This is going to be a very interesting talk. He's going to demonstrate, he's going to use the idea of test-driven development from first principles to kind of demonstrate this. So there's going to be some code, but he's breaking it up. So the idea of becoming an expert is kind of separated from the more code-intensive part. Anyway, even if you're not a coder, I think, but you're interested in how to become more of an expert, I think you'll really enjoy what Alex has to say. And then on the 25th, Mike Clement is coming to talk to us about focus on flow, lean principles in action. A lot of people, the feedback I asked for, a lot of people said they really wanted to hear more about lean. So Mike's going to come and give us some of that information. These will be going out pretty soon. You've probably seen some of them, but here is there's the URL. If you want to make sure it gets on your calendar, you can go to any of those and sign up for them right away. I'll be sending some more out later this week to get these all on your calendar so you can block out the time if it's something you want to come to. And as always, if any of these are things that you think your team would be interested in, feel free to pass them on to your team. Let them know. The invites are designed in a way to where it's just fine to email them on to other people. There's not something unique about them to you that keeps you from being able to forward them on. Okay, so back to our regular programming. We said stories fail when they fail to, or projects fail when they fail to deliver on working software. And we can avoid that by building from the user's perspective. So how does the user think about software? Well, let me give you an example. I live down in Fort Scott, Kansas. We're about 90 miles south of Kansas City. So I might have a story something like this. As a driver of a car, I want trees cleared from Fort Scott to Kansas City so I can level it. So we can level it. Okay, that would be a story. I'm a driver of a car. I want trees cleared from Fort Scott to Kansas City so we can level it. Well, this story may not be such a great story because I'm taking something incremental, and this may be very, very important, but this doesn't give me, as a driver of a car, anything that I can actually do. Now, leveling it might be a piece of something I want to do before I can put in a highway from Fort Scott to Kansas City, but I've written this story in a way that it's very much prescriptive of how we're going to do something rather than describing what we're hoping to obtain from it. So here's another story. Here's another try on it. So if you're not familiar with Fort, so here's Fort Scott down here. Here's Pleasanton. It's like a quarter of the way to Kansas City, and then we've got Kansas City way up there. So here's another try. As a driver of a car, I want a highway from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth. Okay, so now I've gotten something a little bit smaller. I'm just going to put a highway from here to here. So that would be another possible way of doing it, but we're still putting a lot of effort. If the thing I get value from is more of getting to Kansas City, investing in a whole highway from Pleasanton to Fort Scott, there may be a simpler way I can deliver something to start proving out some of my ideas here. So what about something like this? As a driver of a 4x4, so now what I've done is we've now narrowed who the user is to a specific type of user that we can deliver something for more rapidly. So as a driver of a 4x4, I want a trail from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can travel when the weather is good. Okay, now we've narrowed this down quite a bit. So I've got something like this here, right? I've got a really cool 4x4, and I'm going to just get a trail. If the weather's good, I can get from Fort Scott to Pleasanton. So that represents something we could deliver to the user, and they could actually start for one segment of the users, or under certain circumstances when the weather's good, they can start executing this thing that they've said is valuable. Now they can get to Pleasanton. Maybe they take medical supplies back and forth between Pleasanton and Fort Scott when the weather is good, and they couldn't do that at all before, other than like trekking through these woods. Now, I will let you know, this is not what the woods look like around my house. I wish it was, but that's not quite what it looks like here. But, okay, so after I do that, maybe my next story is as the driver of a car. So now I'm expanding who my user is here by saying, as the driver of a car, I want a gravel road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can now drive back and forth. So maybe we get something more like this. It's not a great road, but now we've got the ability to go back and forth between Fort Scott and Pleasanton. So after that, maybe I put in, now I want a paved road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth at high speeds. So now I've got, a paved road doing these things. And then once I finish that, maybe we're getting lots of use out of this back and forth to Pleasanton. Maybe then I say, okay, now let's go ahead and extend the trail all the way to Kansas City. So I can drive back and forth in good weather. So now I've got this trail that goes all the way to Kansas City. I can start going back and forth there. As a driver of 4x4, I want a trail from Fort Scott to Kansas City so I can drive back and forth in good weather. So if you notice here, we've done one thing, and there's many ways we could do this. We're going from Fort Scott to Pleasanton and then making that perfect, proving out that we have the capability of making trails, we have the capability of making gravel roads, and we have the capability of making paved roads. We've got that all proved out, and then we start incrementally working our way up to Kansas City, or we build the next piece up to Kansas City. But we've got a story like this. As a trail driver 4x4, wanted a trail from Fort Scott to Kansas City so I can drive back and forth in good weather, but we really want a highway, right? That's what we wanted. Why would we waste time in building a trail? Well, what if we changed our mind once we've been there? We made it to Kansas City and decided, on second thought, let's not build a highway to Kansas City. 'Tis a silly place, right? There may be some reason once we get to Kansas City that we decide we don't actually want to go there anymore. And those are legitimate things that happen when we're building software. Once we get the ability to do something in software, we need to discover that our original idea of what we want to do would be a silly thing to do. That's not a bad thing to discover, but we'd want to discover this with at least amount of effort as possible. If Kansas City is not a good place to go to, we should decide that when we've only invested in a trail, not when we put in all the infrastructure necessary to put a 4-lane highway to Kansas City. So when you think about this, how much money do you think gets invested in software that turns out not to do what is needed? Because the situation, it can be done all with the best intent, but the situation can change. The market can change. We may have ideas of how things would work that once we've got little pieces of it, we discover it doesn't really work that way anymore. But yet sometimes we go ahead and build the thing that we don't really need anymore. What if we build a highway to Kansas City and discover that the city has been taken over by zombies? Well, maybe it's not good to have a highway all the way to Kansas City that can bring those zombies all the way down to Fort Scott, as they kind of randomly walk around and stuff. So I'm being silly here, but the point is that we want our stories to allow us to do things incrementally and prove things out. Make sure that we're building what's actually needed. And if we write our stories in ways that aren't, in ways that don't actually support that incremental learning, we can get ourselves into all kinds of trouble. Okay, so let's talk about, we mentioned how the users see things. So if you're a developer or have worked with designing stuff, you probably are used to seeing things something like this, where we've got user interface, business logic, database, and hardware. So I want this slice right here, said no user ever, right? Users don't come to you and say, hey, you know what we really need? We really need a database layer. Not something I can talk to, not something I've interacted with, but just a database layer would be really, really cool to have. That's not what they're asking for, right? Now, I want this slice, says the kid that only eats the frosting. But if we really look at what users are asking for, they're wanting something like this, right? When the user's asking for something, they're wanting usually some part that they can touch in the user interface. There's some part that touches the business logic, some part that touches the database, some part and some part that touches the hardware. But there's these slices that go all the way through. And that's how we need to design our user stories so we can deliver things that go all the way through and actually provide them value. Now, the objection to this usually is, well, you can't build a house like that. And that is mostly true, right? It's not like you build the foundation. You don't look at your house and say, hey, you know what? The bathroom is really the most valuable piece to me. Let's lay the foundation for the bathroom, then build the bathroom, and then we'll go figure out what else we're going to do. But code is not concrete. We can do things in code that we absolutely cannot do with building a house. Remember our example back here of being able to do these roads. This is actually more analogous to what we experience with software, that if you put in a trail and get going back and forth, you'll then discover, okay, with the trail, I had to go around this river or find a place to ford the river. But we've gone back and forth and we now know it's valuable enough to invest in, with our gravel road, maybe building a bridge in some of those places. And then once we've got the gravel road in place, we can then come back with a highway and rework some of the road, but a lot of it will probably go in the same place. And we can build on things in ways that increase the value, instead of a house where, like, okay, now we need to tear out the entire foundation and start over. And this gets into kind of the power and the dangers of metaphors, because they're very much tied to the way we think. And so if we think of building software, we're going to take kind of our physical experience with the way things are built and then apply it to abstract ideas in ways that don't necessarily apply to software. Um, we have if you think of the difference between sketching something and carving something. So here we're sketching a horse. I don't know if you guys remember the old things where they teach you how to draw a horse. You draw a circle here, lines, and then you kind of fill stuff in. And pretty soon, the original lines that you used to draw to give you the framework for kind of the outline of the horse, you sometimes erase those or just cover them up and never see them anymore. But they're incremental steps toward getting a horse. And that's how you sketch something, which is very much analogous to what we want to do in software. On the other hand, carving something out of stone, that's not really, software is very malleable. Software is not like trying to carve something out of stone. But if we think of it in terms, if we approach our software with the idea that it's like we're carving something, we'll probably make a bunch of very poor decisions based on what would happen if we did things in concrete and rock, instead of taking advantage of what we actually have to work with. I find that a very good analogy is to think of how a city grows. So if you think of like New York City, they put in a subway one place, used it for years, then put in another subway, and then all of a sudden didn't need that one subway line anymore. So they shut it down. And that wasn't a bad thing. It was part of the growth of the city as populations moved and things like that. And there's buildings that go in that are then torn out and other buildings go in. And this is all part of the evolution of a city over long periods of time. But you don't come in and just say, you build your city in a way that it can grow, instead of trying to say, oh yeah, every 10 years or so, we're just going to tear the whole thing down and try to build it again. That's not how you approach a city. So I think growing is a very good way to think of it, because cities respond to change. And we want to think of growing our software rather than building our software. Okay, so here is a question. If a ship replaces one board every year for 800 years or so, eventually every part of the ship has been replaced. Is it still the same ship? If you've taken a philosophy class, you might recognize this. I might check a few messages here people sent me. Okay, somebody sent me a question, and this is a great question. So she was saying that she's running into situations where people are saying they're trying to write it from a user's perspective, but they end up building just describing how they want to build things behind the scenes. So the example being, as a user, I want the app to call the right API so I can be notified more quickly about the status of my case, or something like that. And this happens a lot. So one of the biggest places that I see that happen is when you break teams up not in ways that they can't actually deliver something for the customer. And so what happens a lot of times, you may have, oh, this team's doing the UI, this team's doing the API. And so then you run into these very difficult things where you've got the person doing the API that doesn't even talk to the customer, doesn't have interaction with the customer. And so if they're trying to think of things from the customer standpoint, the customer doesn't even know what it may not even know what an API is. Now, in some cases, the customer is using an API, but in a lot of cases, if they're using like a web interface, they don't know what a web API is. And that makes it very hard to program things from the standpoint of the customer because we've divided up the work in a way that specifically insulates part of the team from getting feedback from the customer. Um, what I find works better in those situations is to go ahead and create your teams in ways that they can actually deliver something. They can talk to a customer and deliver something that makes the customer happy. And if you keep them completely separate like that, that's going to be really, really hard to do. The other way now, so one thing, make sure that your teams are structured in a way that they can actually be successful in providing what the customer needs and getting that feedback from the customer. Now, if they're writing this because that's how they're approaching the work, which is the other way, so the team is actually talking to the customer, but in their mind they're breaking up the UI from the API, and so they're trying to write a story for both parts. What you want to get them to is thinking in terms of how do we deliver this for the customer, regardless of who's actually working on what piece on the back end. So I think the best thing to do there is try to get them to narrow the story down to the smallest thing they possibly can in a way that's giving a full slice all the way through. And make sure your stories are written in a way that actually means something to the customer. If the story doesn't have any meaning to the customer, then it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for the customer to prioritize and help make decisions about what should come next. So if we're writing stories like this, we're probably getting away from it. Probably the underlying problem is that we're not in a position where we're communicating and really collaborating with the customer to give them the smallest possible thing that provides the maximum amount of value, hopefully in the next few days. And if you're trying to do that, it will kind of push you away from those types of stories. And when I say this isn't something is necessarily easy to do. I've worked with a lot of teams, and usually the first time we hit one of these, I throw out what I'm saying right now, and they're like, "Oh, there's no possible way to do that." So what I'm usually trying to do is nudge them just a little closer to it. Say, okay, well, what can we do to make this more centered on the customer? Can we rewrite it in any way that if we show it to the customer, they would be able to validate whether this is done or not? And we take a baby step toward it. And then when the next story comes, we take a little bit more of a baby step toward it. And over 6 to 8 weeks, you can often shift a team from being where they're thinking in this old way of doing things to where they're starting to ask those questions themselves, and they see a path toward being able to create stories that are written from the customer standpoint like that. So while I'm giving a 30-second, here's how you can approach it. My experience has been it usually takes 4, 5, 6 weeks to get a team to where they're starting to see those things for themselves. I mean, and sometimes even longer than that. So it's not necessarily an easy thing, but you want to take baby steps toward being able to do that. Okay, let's see. What does everybody think on the ship of Theseus? If a ship replaces, okay, yes, it's the same ship. No, it's a different ship. Well, so regardless of what category you fall into, just to let you know, philosophers have been arguing about this for many, many years. So, a matter of fact, when Socrates was getting ready to drink the poison, they had to wait a long time because the ship of Theseus was out on some type of uh, religious thing, and they couldn't kill anybody till it came back. So he had all that time he had to wait for the ship to come back. That ship was the one that for 800 years they had been replacing to keep going, and probably was not made from the same materials it was made originally. Um, so hold this thought, and we're going to think about this a little bit when it comes to software. So here's a graphic that I find useful to show to teams. So if we start out with these different areas, right? We've got the top thing there, which means this story is capable of demonstration. It's a feature that creates a rough means of producing the desired result. So we can use this. It's not maybe not even something we're going to say is ready to go to production, but it lets the functionality be exercised. Then we've got the orange, which is deployable to production. This has the security and everything we need to get it into production. It may not be fully ready to use. It may not even be everything that we possibly want, but the user can use this to say, yes, this is a step closer. This helps make my life better. The green is viable as a system of record. So viable as system of record would mean we've got the bare minimum features to be able to run in place of the current system if we're writing a new system. So this could go live. As viable as system of record, we could take this live and we could start using it. The old system, we might need to, if we're replacing a system, we might need to keep the old system around for a while to look some things up or whatever, but this can actually start functioning on a daily basis of people using it. Blue would be other existing features, so current state features that maybe we don't need to go live. The big example I have of that was a team I was working with that needed to. This was on a project for the Treasury, and they needed to be able. The old system allowed us to go in and put in calendar dates and say these are federal holidays. There was a nice UI for doing that. Well, as we talked to them more, they said, you know what, if we load up the calendar holidays for the next 2 years, we really can defer this. It's an existing feature and we do want it someday, but it's not as important as other things because we can give ourselves a two-year runway on this. So that becomes an existing feature that aren't absolutely required to go live. And then the purple here are a new feature. So enhancement that the current state doesn't have today. Since the current state does not have them today, then we can assume they're not required to go live. But oftentimes, they're the whole reason that we've justified doing the rewrite in the first place or building the system. So if we lay these things out like this, and let's say we approach these stories like this, and we start over there and we do two things that are new features, enhancement that the current state doesn't have today, because these are really, really important to people. And then we get to something that we have to deploy to production. Then we do something else that's a new feature, and we go all the way through like this. We're going to get to the point where we get all the way over here, and we have to do all these things before we can actually go live over here. But if we order our user stories a little bit differently, we now buy ourselves some options of when we go live. So if you hear the example of having a skateboard, a scooter, bike, motorcycle, and then to a car, that's kind of what we've done here down on the bottom, because now at the very beginning, that yellow, we may not be able to go live at that point, but we've now got a point that we can demonstrate some stuff to the users. They can start giving us feedback. And once they start giving us feedback, it's amazing how often their ideas about how the system should progress change dramatically. You get a lot better feedback from a user that's actually using something and touching it than you do when it's all just abstract in their mind and they're trying to throw out everything they could possibly want. So then when we get to that orange part, now we've got our little scooter here. We've now got it's deployable to production. So this might be a place where it's deployed to production and we're starting to run, maybe if it's a system that processes files, we're running files through it on a regular basis to compare to the old system and see how they work, see if there's any differences. Then we get to the point where we've got the green, we've now got the bike version of it. We can actually, this is legitimately something we can use for transportation. We could possibly stop using the old system. And then we build the existing features. The point is with this though, is up here with this ordering, there's only got one option of when we can go live. And that's when we've finished everything that we've done because of the order that we've done our stories in. Whereas here, we have many options of when we could possibly go live. The user very well may say, we don't want to go live until we get all this stuff done, but at least we're doing it in a way that gives them the option to change their mind and decide they want it sooner. Let's say we get halfway into this and budget starts drying up. There's something really, really big that's happening that's causing problems with the budget. It may be very politically expedient to go ahead and go live with what we have now in order to get enough trust to finish the rest of it. But up here, the project might get shut down because we haven't actually delivered something that they can use. So those are things to think about when we're looking for ways of ordering our user stories. And I would keep this in mind. Part of the value of this is to think about how do I write my user stories in a way that actually lets me get this type of capability and this type of flexibility. If I write it in ways that are just building out layers instead of slices, I'm not going to have this capability. I'm going to end up with a database layer or something and nothing to show for it, nothing that I could potentially take live, nothing I can show the user that lets them actually have the confidence that we're making progress, and nothing that I could take live if for some reason the priorities change. This is kind of a similar idea of minimal existing and new features. And if these sound useful, these will be on the recording on the Agile Lunch and Learn YouTube site if you want to get them and pull off screenshots of them. If you want the PDFs of these, send me an email and I can send them if it's something you think would be useful for your team. But I can also start doing things as splitting stories. Maybe when I get into a story, I decide, hey, that first thing that was minimally viable, I can split that out between minimally viable and existing functionality. And then if I do that, maybe I can take those and reorder it and get to this. And now I've got even newer place that, or an even sooner point that I could potentially go live. Or maybe I discover I can actually throw these out if I've split them up. So all kinds of different ways to reorder our stories in ways that get us more flexibility, more agility in how we deliver for the customer. Let's see. So I have an example. Let me look at the questions here because I've got an example here that we can go through, but this might be more interesting to see what people are. Okay, so questions about enabler or spike stories. Um, So I believe what you're talking about are situations where we're saying, oh, we're going to do a spike story just to do some research and see if it's possible to use technology XYZ with this particular thing. Um, the thing I don't like about spike stories, and I say this in very loose terms because I've seen teams use them and have good get good results with them. Um, but oftentimes, what happens with a spike story is since it's not constrained by something we're going to give to the user, it can grow in scope or sometimes head in a different direction than what's actually valuable. And so, what I would suggest with a spike story is if you can, try to take off a small enough slice that you could actually deliver something and show it to the user. Now, if you get into it and discover, hey, this just doesn't work at all, and so you just throw the work away, that's no worse than if it were a spike. On the other hand, if you do get something like, hey, this is proven out this little thing, and yes, we've got lots of stuff to add to it, but we're in a situation now where we can take this and build on it. I think that's a lot better than trying to build out a spike. To me, that keeps the team a lot more focused. And let me give you an example of a team that did this. So I was working with a team. We were writing some stuff for the Treasury that would match debts against payments. So if the government's getting ready to send you money, but you owe the government money somewhere else, it would match those things up. Um, and there's lots of ways to match, lots of different parameters that go into matching it. But we had identified that there were some places where the name was really really close, but not matching for one reason or another. So, for example, if my name was coming through as let's say somebody's name was coming through as Catherine Smith, and then there was a Katie Smith, and everything else matched. We wanted to be able to match on those types of things, being able. So they needed some type of fuzzy logic around being able to match, particularly on the name field, if Social Security number and everything else matched like that. So since this was a very important system, we needed to be careful with it. So the first thing that they built wasn't to go in and actually build everything into the matching process that was going on as part of this batch process. What they did is they built just a little thing that you could type in somebody's name and the identifying information and run it, and it would show you if it matched to anyone. Well, they did that, built it, even deployed it to production, and then all the stakeholders could actually go in and start typing in names to see, hey, does this match with this? Does this match with this? And so it was a spike in the sense that they weren't delivering something that was going to actually, well, I guess it did run in production, but it wasn't going to affect the application's output. But it was something that the user could actually touch and validate. So they were able to come up with a slice that let the user validate it. And what happened is the user came back with feedback after that and said, hey, that really works well in this situation, but not in this situation. And the developers could say, okay, I think we can tweak it to now that we're getting your feedback, we can tweak it to handle what you're describing. So they'd make some changes, deploy it, and they'd go look at it again. Then the next thing they took is they made it to where the matches still weren't changing the system of record, but every time that this new thing would match, it would write out to a log file. And then they were able to pour over the log files and see how that was. And the users were getting feedback on whether or not they were able to give feedback on whether or not they wanted to turn this on. And then finally, they made it to where it was part of the process. But those types of things where you're using, in this case, they were using some new fuzzy matching technology. Those types of things where you give the customer something they can provide feedback on. I mean, it would have been just fine if the customer had said, oh, you know what, after seeing this, I don't think we should do that. It looks like it has too many false positives. That would have been just fine. But so when you're doing spikes, long way of saying, when you're doing spikes, I would still try to make sure that you're writing it as a user story that can be deployed to production, that the user can give you feedback on. And if you have to abandon it, That's fine. You're no worse off than if you were doing a spike. But if you can use it, you're now in a situation that you can get feedback, better feedback, and you've been constrained by what you can actually deliver to the user. So hopefully that's a helpful way to think of it. Okay, let me glance through here, see if there's any other questions. Okay, and Ian had a good says he's got a YouTube link that looks good. I'm gonna have to check that one out. Let's see, were there any other? Remodeling the ship. Okay. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody's thing there. So I'll give just a really brief kind of looking at Sam's shoes. So Sam's a very prestigious shoe shop that hasn't been selling anything online. And so, it's been in the family for generations. So Sam may say, as Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. Well, that's a pretty big user story. That may be too big to actually be actionable. And if we deliver this entire story and turns out we made a mistake, Sam's now spent lots of money on a solution that may not be what he needs. So if working software is the primary measure of progress, we might end up with a story like this. As a user, I want the system to work so I will be happy. Well, that's almost the same level that Sam's story is here. So how can we improve this? Well, this would involve creating all these things, right? Is probably what Sam's thinking. So we might have a story, want to have a developer say, I want a story as a developer, I want an API to the database so web services can query it. But that's not written from the user standpoint. So maybe we need a story, something like this. As a customer, I want to see inventory so I can call in to order. So now this is a very small incremental step toward what Sam is asking for, but it's a lot more manageable. We don't have to deal with some of the security stuff. We don't have to deal with payments, anything. This is just saying, can we get our stuff online? So we might end up with something that looks like this. We've got our different types of shoes. And like I said, Sam's Shoe Store is a very prestigious store. So they even do all their descriptions in Latin instead of in English or some other language. But you can just see what's in stock. You can see what's in stock and call into order. Well, the return on investment from this is hopefully we'll get some orders, but we'll also get some metrics. And we're going to prove out some assumptions. We may find that Sam's Shoe Store customers don't want to order anything online. They want to come down and see Sam or Sam's grandson, who's now running the store, also named Sam. And that's what they see as being valuable. So you can actually prove some of these things out. And this isn't an entirely hypothetical example. Zappos basically did this before they sold to Amazon when they were first starting up. They weren't sure if people would actually buy things on the internet and put them on their feet. Maybe there's some type of deep revulsion to putting shoes on your feet if they came through the mail. Who knows? But what they did is they went down to the Foot Locker, bought a bunch of shoes, took pictures of them, returned them to Foot Locker, and then if somebody would order one, they'd go back to Foot Locker, buy it, and ship it out. Now, that wasn't the most efficient way to do anything, but it was the most efficient way to actually prove out their ideas about whether or not people would actually buy things online. It turned out they would, and so then they built out the rest of the system. So that's just this Sam shoes can be a very detailed thing. So I'm going to kind of skip through the rest of that. But the point is, we can go from that to them being able to get to the point where they actually can order one shoe, one pair of shoes at a time. And then maybe later we want to, they just type in the credit card information and order. Very simple. And then maybe we grow that to where now we add a shopping cart. But the point is, we can deliver things incrementally in a way that let us prove out all of our assumptions and prove out that what Sam's asking for actually works with his customers that are trying to use the system. Okay, so I'm going to skip through here. Okay, so question that we asked kind of earlier is, but now related to software, at what point do you have new software? Is it A, once the last line of original code has been replaced with through a process of weekly changes, or B, when a new application is created and the old data is migrated over, or both A and B is a new application? And once again, there is no right answer here, but what I want us to get thinking about is the idea of evolving software. And when we're using our user stories effectively, our software should be evolving over time. And maybe it looks something like this, to where we eventually get to the point that our software has evolved to where no lines of code are still being used, or a very small segment of line of code is still being used, or maybe we don't know, and it doesn't matter because we've continued to evolve in the way that meets the customer's needs. And that's probably the most important thing there. Okay, so we got kind of widespread spread here on things. So let's see if there's any questions. Oh yes, got a story here as a Scrum Master. I want to access YouTube playlist called Agile Principles so I can easily find all the Agile Principles videos in one place. That's a good story. I should probably implement that story now. Okay, I think that's all the questions that were on there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the streaming to YouTube, but I'll stick around if